Something that makes me feel like lemons sometimes, honestly, is artificial intelligence. And if you're somebody who's trying to figure out what the heck to do with your career, if you're worried about whether or not your job is going to be made redundant simply because of AI, if you're really loving AI and you're looking to pivot into AI so that you can, continue to have longevity in your career, all for it, but there is this overall sense of we don't know what the heck is about to happen in the world, and nobody does, right? Well, maybe some of the tech people do, or at least they think they do, or they're at the forefront of what's happening. And then there are people like me who's quite frankly 50 years old and a little bit confused and wondering what does this pivot mean or what is going to happen, and not knowing what's happening in the future, and then really just refocusing on my day to day and trying to come back to life as normal. There are certain aspects of AI and, like, let's say ChatGPT that make a ton of sense actually and are really, really helping my clients in big ways. And so on today's episode, I wanted to share with you some of the ways that my clients at the executive level are using ChatGPT specifically for their career search and their platforms as thought leaders. And some of these may be obvious tools that you might be using. If you're using ChatGPT or Claude in various other ways, I would love, love, love to hear from it. And then, I also want to acknowledge that so many of you as listeners know a lot more about these various different AI features and are probably using it to an incredible extent in your actual day to day job. So I'm not getting into any of that. I am not an expert in AI by any means, but I am an expert in my clients and what's helping them make it into those higher levels of leadership. And here's some of those ways. So, the first and most obvious thing that I think a lot of people, especially on the job search, are doing is putting their resume into ChatGPT, putting their LinkedIn profile, and they're getting feedback on the other side of what should be changed and what could not be changed or whatever. And so, that's something that you can definitely do. And I think that there are formulas out there so that you can do it better than other formulas. A lot of my clients who were laid off in the past couple of years have an outsourcing agency that they're working with that actually has a lot of AI features to help people, even to answer interview questions. Those feel like kind of the low hanging fruit. But the reason why I'm starting off with that is because when you start to do that, if you haven't already noticed this, it can fall short, right? So you are going to put, whatever in and update your resume. A lot of people are doing job comparisons. So they'll put in the job description and then they'll see if their resume matches this job description. And I've been using jobscan.com for my clients and pointing them in that direction for years. And that's essentially what that platform does is it says, okay, is this a good match for the algorithm? Now, the reason why I say sometimes it's going to fall short is because of this misconception that as soon as you do that, you are ready, like to beat the algorithm, to have a successful LinkedIn profile. And so a lot of women will do that work and they'll put it out there and then they'll say, well, why am I not getting the interviews? And so I call this level of work baseline. So it's just basically get your assets in order and make sure that you have decent cover letters, decent resumes, that your LinkedIn profile is up to date, right? So if you haven't, I highly encourage you to use AI in this way to get your assets in order, right? So imagine if you're using my second degree connection strategy and you're reaching out and you're direct messaging people or you're connecting with colleagues and friends and you're talking about opportunities and then they say, apply for this job and you're not ready, right? You haven't updated your assets in a while. You want to make sure that all of that is ready to go. Another thing that I do with clients, especially when I work with them one on one, is once they've updated their assets, then I read them and I say, okay, what's the story that your resume is telling me? Right. And so it's kind of like beyond the algorithm. So you want your resume or your LinkedIn profile or your cover letter to fit the mold, right? To make it through the first draft of the algorithm. And then the work that I do when I'm coaching my clients is make it stand out, right? Make it sound like an executive leadership resume on top of it. Make it sound like it's unique to you so that you don't sound cookie cutter like everybody else who's applying for these jobs. So, yes, it's very important to make it past the algorithm. And then what? Right now, you actually have to stand out. And the other reason why this is so important, and I think this reminder doesn't go without saying, is that you want to be in a job where you don't have to consistently prove yourself, right? You want your ideas and what you uniquely bring to the table to be enough. And so when you interview in that way, or when and this is all beyond the resume, when you interview in that way and you're really having these higher level conversations, even as part of the interview process, the chances of you being able to get hired and then continue to have those higher level conversations so openly with your boss or your boss's boss is like exponentially higher when you interviewed that way, right? So, yes, the algorithm can get us started for sure. It opens up the door, but then you have to actually walk through the door and make something happen for yourselves. If you don't have your assets in order, use AI to get your assets in order. All right. And then you can come and work with me in coaching and we'll make it even stronger and we'll make sure we get you across the finish line. Another thing that and these are a couple more surprising things that my clients are using AI for, is to be able to research companies that they're interviewing for. And so when you go one step deeper than the website, right? So a lot of times when you're interviewing at a company, you might look at their website and get some research and understand where they're at. But if you go into ChatGPT or Claude or whatever platform you might use and you ask questions about specifically what is the CEO talking about in the news? What are some of the talking points? What is the company leading with in terms of marketing? What are the long term goals for the organization? This is going to go so much deeper than what they traditionally put on their website. And if you can start to read that and embed that and understand that and know that, then you're going to ask so much stronger questions in your interview process. And you're going to have so much better background knowledge when you're interviewing for these opportunities. So that's for on the interview side. But imagine if you start doing this about your organization. There was something like 20 years ago, I feel like maybe it was 15, 20 years ago, that, a lot of people would do is just like Google themselves. And so I've always been in the entertainment industry. And so Googling myself is real, right? Like, articles would pop up from college, or like I've been in the newspaper often. And so this is like a real thing. I just be very curious. And so there is also another Stacy Mayer who does coloring books. I don't know, whatever. And she pops up in Google search. And now it's been a long time since I Googled myself. So I don't know what would pop up today, but those are the main things that used to pop up for me. Do that for your boss. Do that for your CEO at your current organization. What are their talking points? What are they actually saying? What's appearing? What's coming up? What's being translated? How are they thinking? You can look up this information and just use it as data points. Like, even if you don't quote it back or actually put it into anything, understand and use platforms like ChatGPT and Claude to help you organize your thoughts. Because a big part of executive communication is to repeat the words that other people say, right? So you don't say things like, I read this, on ChatGPT, I was researching you and it said this. You just say, I know that you really care about being first to market. And you're like, "So what we're working on is gonna not only get us first to market, but it's gonna help blah, blah, blah," and just like on and on and on, right? So you're able to translate what it is that they're saying all the time, but it's really important to even know what that might be, right? And another thing that I think is really cool that my clients are using AI for right now is they're recording their interviews or recording some of their conversations. Now, I think there might be legal ways that you can record these conversations, certainly on Zoom or platforms like that. It tells the other person that you're recording the conversation. All of that is so normalized now that, recording a conversation is not that huge of a deal. And I think what we would do traditionally is we would go back and listen to the conversation ourselves. But instead, they're plugging that conversation into AI and they're asking, how did here are my goals for this conversation. I want to show up as a peer, or I want to show up at that vice president level, or I want to make sure I'm clearly articulating my value proposition, or like whatever those goals might be. They're putting that recording into ChatGPT, and then they're asking, "Did I show up as a peer in this conversation?" And it's reflecting back to them, yes or no. And here are the ways that your status dropped. Imagine that. Your status dropped. You were rambling on and on. You sounded like you had to prove yourself. Now, I don't know if it's ChatGPT or Claude or whatever platform they're using that is given that granular of data, but how amazing is that? Because you want to know what energy, what persona you're putting out there. And so when you're interviewing for a job, like, are you interviewing as their peer? Are you interviewing as somebody who has to prove yourself? Did you prove yourself? Did you use the STAR method appropriately? Like, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish and you want to get out of your interviews, ask that and see what it reflects back to you so that you can begin to course correct. Now, these are just like very simple things that you could do today and begin to use these platforms in a stronger way, in a unique way. But really, what I would like you to get out of today's episode is that we have, which so many tools available to us that will tell us if we're headed in the right direction or not. Now, as long as you're being specific, right? So you want to make sure in whatever questions, whatever format, whatever way that you're asking it, that you're still using your brain to decipher that information. So when you're asking, "Did I show up as a peer on this interview?" is a much better question because like, I don't know if AI is going to answer it better, right? Because there's like all these prompts that you can use and ways that you can ask prompts to get better answers. But from my opinion, asking, "Did I show up as a peer in this interview?" is a much stronger question than, "Did I interview well?" If you say something like, "Did I interview well?" I can almost guarantee that the answers are going to be based on your professionalism. Did you pause? Did you say or ah? Did you articulate your value well, or something like that? That is not as relevant at that executive level. At the executive level, you want to sound like a peer. You want to sound like somebody they want to work with, right? And so use these technologies to see if we're showing up in our conversations as peer to peer. And I just think if you put in your resume, in addition to like, does it match this job search? And instead of just saying, does it match this, which is important, again, get your assets in order, but also, what is the story that I'm telling through this resume, right? And I'm sure there's a more viable prompt that you could actually type in there, but really ask yourself the questions and maybe experiment with it and play around with it. All right, so this is just a few topics, a few ways that you can begin to use artificial intelligence in your own career journey. I hope this was helpful. Please continue to reach out and let me know how you're specifically using AI to advance your career.